Why are you here this late? What are you doing inside? Is this your store?
We're working. Nothing is happening here. Why are you treating this like a crime?
I've never seen it active at this hour,
Yeah,
so explain it.
it's
Prove
yours.
it's yours.
If there's no alarm and no burglary call, what's the legal reason you're demanding proof?
The officer was standing in their doorway, like the store had tripped an invisible alarm. And Yema Khalif and Howie Awash were already realizing this was not a quick check, because he kept demanding answers, like their presence needed permission. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we run it back, comment where you're watching from. And if you watch these stories because you care about calm nerves, clean documentation, and real accountability, when authority starts pushing past its limits, hit like and subscribe, because that's exactly what this is. At around 1 a.m., Yema Khalif and Howie Awash were inside their small neighborhood store in Tiburon, along with a third person who was with them that night, with the lights on and the space looking normal, like late-night work was happening and nothing more. A police officer walked up and treated the scene like an issue that needed to be explained, not like a business handling its own night. He framed his approach as concern, but he kept circling the same suspicion, pressing them on why they were there, why they were open that late, and what they were doing, as if being inside was automatically something they had to justify. Yema and Howie stayed calm and answered in a steady way, but the officer kept escalating through repetition, acting like the fact that he personally had not seen the store active at that hour was enough reason to interrogate them. When they questioned why it mattered, he leaned into authority and tried to box them in with a simple power move. If it was not their store, then they had no standing to question him. And if it was their store, then they had to prove it to him. That was the trap, because either way the burden shifted onto Yema and Howie, and the officer positioned himself as the person who decided whether their explanation was acceptable. The situation tightened further when they noticed body language signaling escalation, including the officer keeping a hand in his pocket, and one of them asked him to de-escalate by removing it, not as a challenge, but as a safety boundary. Instead of treating that as a reasonable request, the officer made it about control, talking like it was his duty to protect the town and the property, while refusing to give basic accountability in return when Yema and Howie asked him to identify himself. That refusal was a turning point because it clarified the imbalance. He demanded answers, demanded compliance, demanded proof, but resisted even the simplest transparency about who he was. That was when Yema and Howie called out what they believed was the real trigger for the stop, pointing to the fact that there were 3 black people in the store late at night, and the officer tried to flatten it into a generic statement about 3 people of any background, but they kept the focus on the behavior, not the excuse. Not long after, additional officers arrived, including a supervisor, and the department's posture became the story, because now it was not one officer improvising. It was multiple officers deciding whether to correct the approach or reinforce it. The supervisor framed the encounter as standard policing, emphasizing the hour and claiming the store never had activity at that time. And Yema and Howie immediately demanded clarity about what the next step was, because they understood that vague suspicion could stretch forever if nobody forced it into specifics. The officers responded by demanding proof of ownership, pushing Yema and Howie to demonstrate they had keys and to physically use a key in the door as a test, as if the owners had to perform legitimacy in their own space just to make the pressure stop. Yema resisted because the demand was humiliating and backward, and the standoff held, with the officers pressing for a prove-it moment, and Yema and Howie refusing to be treated like suspects without a real reason. And that was the moment the entire situation balanced on a single detail: whether anyone outside the couple would validate what should never have needed validation. The standoff didn't get louder, but it got sharper, because the officers stopped pretending they were just curious and started acting like Yema Khalif and Howie Awash had to pass a test to earn basic respect inside their own store. The supervisor held the line for the department, repeating that the hour alone justified the stop, and the other officers backed it with that quiet crowd pressure that makes a simple interaction feel like a courtroom where the civilians are the only ones on trial. Yema and Howie kept asking for the next step, not because they were confused, but because they understood the danger of an open-ended investigation based on vibes, where the officers could keep stretching the encounter until someone finally snapped and gave them an excuse. The officers answered by demanding proof, insisting that the owners show they had keys and physically demonstrate access, framing it as an easy way to end the situation, like it was a harmless request and not a public humiliation ritual. Yema resisted immediately because the demand wasn't neutral. It was the department saying, "Prove you belong here to our satisfaction," even though there was no burglary call, no alarm, and no evidence that any crime had happened. That resistance turned the moment into a power contest because the officers didn't want to leave without winning something. And Yema didn't want to validate the idea that ownership needed to be performed for approval. Howie stayed steady beside him, reinforcing the same point with calm, clear pushback, keeping the focus on the logic. If there was no report of wrongdoing, then the officers needed a real reason to keep escalating. Not a feeling, not a hunch, not a personal opinion about what time a store should be active. The supervisor tried to keep it framed as normal policing, but the more he did that, the more it sounded like a policy problem, because normal in this context meant people getting treated like suspects purely because their presence looked unusual to an officer. The pressure built in small ways, with officers repeating the key demand, repeating the hour, repeating the idea that they were simply checking, while simultaneously treating a refusal as suspicious, which is the oldest trick in these encounters. Make compliance the only way out, then call anything else a threat. Yema and Howie didn't take the bait, and that mattered because they were playing the only chess game that works when you're outnumbered by authority. Stay calm, stay consistent, make them justify every step, and make sure the record shows who escalated and why. Then the tiny detail changed. A neighbor came up, described as a white resident from nearby, and spoke casually like this whole thing was obvious, vouching for Yema and Howie and confirming that it was their store. And the tone flipped so fast, it almost felt like a different scene. The officers immediately dropped the pressure, dropped the demands, dropped the posture, and shifted into polite closure, thanking the neighbor, acting friendly, and moving toward leaving, as if the last several minutes hadn't happened. That was the moment that exposed the real problem, because the owners didn't prove anything new about the store itself, and the officers didn't uncover any new facts about a crime, and no alarm suddenly appeared, and no report suddenly came in. The only thing that changed was whose voice carried weight. Yema and Howie had been saying calmly that there was no issue, that they belonged there, but that wasn't accepted as enough. The moment a white neighbor confirmed it, it became enough, and the encounter ended. That ending was the whole point, because it showed what the department was willing to treat as credible, and what it was willing to treat as questionable, even when the questionable thing was simply two owners standing in their own business at a late hour. Once the video circulated, the story stopped being about a late-night check and started being about a department getting caught on camera doing what people had been describing for years. Yema Khalif and Howie Awash didn't need to dramatize it because the footage did that work on its own. Multiple officers, no burglary call, no alarm, no concrete evidence of a crime. And still the owners were treated like they had to earn the right to exist in their own space. The backlash hit fast because the public could see the pattern clearly. Suspicion first, justification later, and then a sudden calm exit, the moment a white neighbor validated what the owners had been saying from the beginning. That public pressure pushed the situation out of the internal review zone and into a real-world consequences zone, where the town had to respond in a way that looked measurable. In the aftermath, Yema and Hawi received a $150,000 settlement from the town of Tiburon, and they were explicit that the money wasn't just going into a private pocket, because they tied part of it to a scholarship effort connected to their store, aimed at supporting orphan youth in Ethiopia and Kenya. At the same time, the accountability didn't land neatly across every nearby jurisdiction involved, because the neighboring city, Belvedere, was not included in that settlement outcome the same way. And the broader fallout inside local law enforcement included major public scrutiny, internal shakeups, and leadership consequences that showed the department understood how bad it looked. But what mattered most was the choice Yema and Howie made about leverage. Instead of treating the settlement like an endpoint, they treated it like a bargaining chip, pushing the conversation toward policy changes that would outlive the headlines, because they understood something most people learned too late. Money closes a case, but reforms change the next case. So the focus shifted to what they demanded as part of the response. They pushed for updated policy and training standards, for a structure where community feedback wasn't just a comment box that got ignored, and for basic transparency tools that made it harder for officers to hide behind vagueness when people needed to file concerns. That's where the reforms started taking shape. A citizens' advisory panel was created as part of the response, and Yema and Howie were given seats, which mattered because it moved them from being treated like subjects of an incident to being treated like stakeholders with standing. Officers were also required to carry business cards that included clear information on how to file a complaint or concern, which sounds small, but it changes the power dynamic in everyday encounters because it makes the accountability path visible in the moment instead of buried later. A community liaison pilot program was introduced as another layer, aiming to narrow the gap between residents and law enforcement before incidents turned into confrontations. And the department increased the frequency of bias training, described as moving from a long cycle schedule to a tighter one, because the optics of "we do this once every several years" stopped sounding like professionalism and started sounding like negligence. Through all of it, Yema and Howie kept the core argument simple. The encounter was treated like a criminal scenario without any real criminal trigger, and the only reason it gained legitimacy in the officers' minds was when a white neighbor confirmed what the owners had already said. That's what made it a bias story, not a misunderstanding story. Because when there is no call, no alarm, and no evidence, but people still get forced to prove they belong, the proof was never about property. It was about permission. By the time the dust settled, the department's original framing didn't survive, because the public had watched the same sequence too clearly to pretend it was routine. Yema Khalif and Howie Awash were treated like a problem first, and then everyone went searching for a reason second. That became the central contrast people couldn't unsee. There was no burglary call that night. There was no alarm going off. There was no report that anyone had forced entry. There was no concrete evidence of a crime in progress. Yet the owners still got boxed into an escalating set of demands where just answering wasn't enough and proving became the only exit. And the most telling piece wasn't even the demand for keys. It was how quickly the entire posture changed the moment a white neighbor vouched for them, because that moment showed the officers were not waiting on a fact. They were waiting on a specific kind of validation. That's why the community response didn't stay focused on one officer, because even when a supervisor arrived, the direction stayed the same. Treat the late hour as probable cause, treat refusal as suspicious, treat ownership as something that had to be demonstrated, and treat basic questions from the owners as if they were challenges to authority. So when backlash hit, it hit the department as a system. The fallout included public outrage, official embarrassment, and internal consequences that stretched beyond the street-level officers, because incidents like this forced leadership to choose between two options: admit the culture needs correction, or keep defending what the public can plainly see. In Tiburon, the visible response became a mix of settlement, reform promises, and structural changes that were designed to show this could not just be brushed away. The $150,000 settlement was one part, and Yema and Howie made sure it wasn't framed like hush money, tying part of it to a scholarship fund meant to benefit orphaned youth in Ethiopia and Kenya, because they wanted the outcome to produce something constructive instead of simply closing a file. But the bigger shift was what they demanded instead of chasing the largest possible payout. They pushed reforms that would change the daily mechanics of policing, not just the press releases. They pushed updated policies and training, and they pushed for community oversight through a citizens advisory panel with seats for themselves, so the people who lived the consequences would have a voice in the process going forward. They pushed a business card requirement, so officers could not refuse basic identification and then disappear into the bureaucracy, and so residents would have a clear, immediate route to file concerns without having to guess what forms to find or who to call. They pushed a community liaison pilot because they understood that relationships don't get repaired through statements. They get repaired through consistent contact that doesn't start with suspicion. And they pushed more frequent bias training, described as moving from a long gap between sessions to a tighter schedule. Because we do this once in a while. Stop sounding like prevention when the damage is already recorded and replayed. The narrator's takeaway landed where the footage always pointed. This was not about the store being open late. This was about who the officers believed belonged there without proof. Because when a business owner has to prove he belongs inside his own store without any real evidence that a crime is happening, the system is not responding to a threat. It is creating one. And the scariest part is how close encounters like that sit to the edge, where one wrong tone, one misunderstood movement, or one officer deciding to escalate can turn a ridiculous situation into a life-changing one. So if you made it to the end, drop where you're watching from. And tell me if you've ever seen a situation like this play out in your own town. Because the details change, but the pattern stays the same. And if you want more stories where calm people document everything and still force accountability when the badge tries to push past its limits, hit like, subscribe, and stay here. Because the next one is just as real.
We got a call, someone waving a gun. You match the description. I need your ID.
What description? I'm sitting here minding
Black
my
shirt,
business.
black glasses, that's you. Hand over your license.
No, I don't have to give you ID just because you walked up here. I didn't do anything.
If you keep getting into it, it's going to get worse for you.
Don't threaten me for saying no. You're turning this into something it doesn't have to be, and you know it.
Imagine sitting on a park bench doing absolutely nothing, and the next thing you know, an officer is standing over you saying, you match the description. Not your face, not your height, not anything specific. Just your shirt and your glasses. And the scariest part? The moment you refuse to play along, the officer doesn't just get annoyed. He starts building a case out loud, right there in front of everyone, like he's writing your future in real time. All right, quickly, where are you watching from? What country or state? And if you like stories where staying calm and knowing your rights actually changes the outcome, hit like and subscribe, because these situations are way more common than people think. Now, here's what really happened. Edward Hale had been sitting on a bench in the middle stretch of the park, the area where the path stayed busy and people drifted past, without paying attention to anyone else. Black t-shirt, black framed glasses, phone in his hand. Nothing dramatic. Just a guy taking a break. Officer Grant Tiller walked up like he'd already decided what he was looking at. He told Edward he matched a description from a call, someone waving a gun, and he tried to turn that into an ID check immediately. Edward didn't stand up. He didn't get loud. He simply refused and made it clear there was no reason to hand over identification when he was sitting there minding his business. Tiller didn't move on from it. He repeated the matches the description line, as if saying it enough times would make it a legal basis. He said he just needed to make sure Edward wasn't armed. Edward answered that he wasn't, and he didn't add anything else. Then Tiller pushed for a driver's license anyway, like Edward had been pulled over, like the bench was a traffic stop. Edward refused again. That's when Tiller's tone shifted into pressure. He warned Edward that if he kept getting into it, it would get worse for him. And when Edward shifted even slightly, Normal body movement, nothing sudden. Tiller reacted like it was suspicious, demanding to know what he was reaching for and why he was moving. Edward didn't give him the satisfaction of performing fear. He kept his boundary and treated the questions for what they were: fishing. Tiller stepped back and keyed his radio. And this was the moment the encounter started turning dangerous, not because anything new happened, but because of how it was being framed. Over the radio, Tiller described Edward as uncooperative in a weapon investigation, emphasized refusal to provide a license, and requested backup and a supervisor. While they waited, the argument got sharper. Edward accused Tiller of getting physical, putting hands on him. Edward warned that if the officer touched him again, it wouldn't end well. Tiller treated that warning as a threat and said so out loud, right there, locking the moment into a narrative that could justify escalation. Edward made it clear he was recording. He said the badge number was on camera. He said everything was on camera, and that mattered because it changed who had control of the story. When the second unit finally arrived, Tiller immediately delivered his version. Gun call, matching description, refusal to cooperate, refusal to be checked, refusal to show ID. Edward interrupted and said he answered questions, but didn't have to hand over identification. And he repeated that the officer had been aggressive and touched him for no reason. Edward also stated he was a lawyer, less as a flex, more as a warning that this wouldn't stay a park argument. The supervisor didn't match Tiller's energy. They listened, looked at Edward, looked at the scene, and didn't treat the bench like a battlefield. After a short evaluation, the supervisor ended it. Edward was told he was free to go. And even though the confrontation kept ending messy, with yelling, insults, and Edward talking about court, the most important part was simple. The stop didn't go anywhere. Because it couldn't. The second unit didn't arrive like a rescue, it arrived like a reset. Sergeant Dana Ruiz stepped in and did the first thing Officer Tiller hadn't done yet. They looked at the whole scene like it was a public space, not a private showdown. Ruiz clocked the details fast. Edward still seated, no crowd panic, no one pointing, no frantic caller waiting to identify the guy with the gun. Just an officer standing rigid and a man holding his ground with a phone camera angled up. Tiller started talking immediately, trying to control the narrative before Ruiz could build their own. He framed it as a weapon call first, then layered the rest underneath. Edward matched the description. Edward refused to cooperate. Edward refused ID. Edward wouldn't let him check him. It was the kind of explanation that sounded solid, until someone asked what it was actually built on. Ruiz didn't match the tone. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't get pulled into the ego part. They asked for specifics, not what happened, but what can you articulate? Ruiz asked what the description was beyond clothing. Tiller repeated the clothing. Ruiz asked if dispatch gave anything else. Height, build, age, direction of travel, anything distinguishing. Tiller didn't have much. Ruiz asked Seed if Tiller had seen a weapon. No. Ruiz asked if any witness on scene was identifying Edward right now. No. Ruiz asked where the waving happened and whether the caller stayed to point anyone out. Tiller's answer made it clear the caller was gone or never visible. Then Ruiz asked the question that changed the temperature. What exactly did Edward do that made him a safety risk in this moment? Something beyond refusing an ID request. Tiller tried to use Edward's refusal as the risk itself. The logic was basically, he won't identify himself, so he might be the one. Ruiz didn't accept that. Not outwardly, not with a lecture, just with silence and another question. They asked about hands, about waistband, about bulges, about any specific movement that indicated access to a weapon. Tiller pointed to Edward shifting, asking what he was reaching for. Ruiz looked at Edward's hands and then looked at the phone. And this is where the tiny detail mattered. Because Edward wasn't just recording with his phone. He was recording in a way that forced his hands to stay visible. One hand holding the phone, the other open, not buried in pockets, not hidden under the bench. And because he'd kept that posture from the start, the officer couldn't honestly claim a sudden lunge or a furtive grab without risking a direct contradiction on video. That tiny choice, how he held the phone in his hands, quietly removed one of the most common excuses officers lean on when things escalate. I thought he was reaching. Ruiz saw it. Ruiz also saw something else. The park had people, multiple angles. An older woman walking the loop had been filming too, steady and silent, not performing, just documenting. A couple of passers-by had slowed down long enough to take out their phones. Even if nobody spoke up, the moment wasn't private anymore. And in a situation like this, privacy is where bad decisions breathe. Ruiz turned to Edward and asked the kind of questions that lowered the pressure without rewarding the officer's approach. They checked whether Edward had a weapon. Edward again stated he didn't. Ruiz watched how he answered. Measured, controlled, irritated but not erratic. Tiller tried to pull it back into authority. He kept circling to the ID. He kept implying that refusal itself was suspicious. He kept trying to turn, "I want your ID," into, "You must." Edward didn't budge. He didn't try to impress the supervisor. He didn't over-explain. He kept it tight. He was sitting there, he had no weapon, and he wasn't handing over ID just because someone said he matched black shirt, black glasses. Then Edward dropped the point that really mattered. Not as a speech, but as a boundary. He said he was prepared to take it to court, and he had everything recorded, including the earlier contact when Tiller put hands on him. That was the second tiny detail. Because hands on me changes how supervisors hear the rest. It turns an awkward stop into a potential complaint with a timeline. It turns a vague call into a use of force question. Why did contact happen? What policy allowed it? What did you perceive at the moment you touched him? Ruiz didn't argue about it on the sidewalk. They didn't need to. They just started steering the scene toward the safest exit. Ruiz told Tiller to step back, subtle but clear. They told Edward he was free to go. Not, "You're lucky," not, "Do me a favor," not, "Next time," just, "You're free to go." That one sentence was Ruiz signaling something important without saying it out loud. There wasn't enough here to lawfully force the ID, and there wasn't enough here to justify turning this into a search without creating a bigger problem for the department than the original call. Tiller didn't like it. He wanted the win. He wanted compliance he could point to. He wanted Edward to feel small before he left. But supervisors don't always care about wins. They care about what survives review. Edward stood up slowly, still recording, making sure there was no sudden movement to be interpreted for him. He left with the kind of controlled anger that's more dangerous to a bad cop than shouting, because controlled anger gets organized. It gets timestamped. It gets filed. The ending in the park still sounded messy. Raised voices. The officer telling him to leave. Edward talking about court. But the outcome was already decided. Edward walked away without cuffs. And the officer walked away with a problem that didn't end when the bench line disappeared behind them. Because once you've been recorded trying to turn a vague description into an ID demand, and once a supervisor has to shut it down, there's a trail, and trails lead places. By that evening, the park bench stop stopped being a moment and turned into a file. Edward didn't just have a clip. He had a clean timeline. The approach, the description, the ID demand, the escalation language, the radio framing, the hands-on contact accusation, and then the supervisor ending it. It wasn't cinematic. It was worse than that, because it was ordinary. He trimmed the video the way people do when they want the truth to land, not with the dramatic edits, but with the parts that showed pattern. The repeated matches the description. The jump from gun call to ID, the "it'll get worse." The radio call that painted him as a threat. Then he posted it. Not with a long caption, not with a speech. Just enough context to lock the facts in place. A weapon call with a vague description, an ID demand, escalation after refusal, supervisor arrival, and release. And once it hit the local feed, it moved fast for one reason. People recognized it. Not Edward specifically, the dynamic. Comment sections filled with the same theme in different words. People describing how refusing turned into suspicious, how officer safety became a blank check, how vague descriptions were used like permission slips. But Edward didn't rely on comments, he relied on paperwork. The next morning, he did what most people don't do because it's tedious and unglamorous. He built the paper trail while the department's memory was still fresh. He filed a complaint that matched the footage minute by minute. He wrote it like someone who expected it to be reviewed by a supervisor, an internal affairs investigator, and possibly a city attorney. No exaggeration, no insults, just actions, quotes paraphrased, and times. He also requested records, dispatch call notes, CAD logs, body-worn camera footage from both officers, any incident or field interview card generated, any mention of threat documented after Edward warned the officer not to touch him again, any supervisor notes explaining why the stop was ended. And here's where the chess game shifted again. Records requests force a department to choose between two uncomfortable options: admit the stop had no legs or invent legs after the fact, and risk contradicting video. Meanwhile, the video kept spreading locally. A neighborhood page posted it. A community safety group reposted it with a short summary. A local civil rights attorney reshared it and asked for witnesses who recorded. The older woman from the park, quiet recorder, ended up in Edward's messages with her own angle, steadier and wider than his, showing the posture, the distance, and how the scene looked to passers-by. Two cameras, two angles, same story. That second video mattered because it removed a common defense, the idea that the citizen's camera started late or missed what happened right before. Her angle showed the before and during, and it showed something simple. Edward wasn't charging at anyone. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't acting like someone waving a gun. He was sitting until the officer turned it into a standoff. Within a week, the department couldn't treat it like a private complaint anymore. A city council staffer asked the department for a briefing. Not because council staffers love work, but because public clips like that trigger calls, emails, and community meetings. Local reporters sent questions. The department's public information office did what they always do first: asked for time, said they were reviewing, reminded everyone the call involved a possible weapon. But that line didn't land the way it used to. Because Edward's video didn't show an officer carefully investigating a threat. It showed an officer trying to control a man with an ID demand and building a weapon call narrative when the man didn't comply. And people could feel the difference. Internally, the attention hit Officer Tiller in small ways first. A supervisor asked for a summary of the stop written. Another supervisor pulled his Bodycam tag and made sure it was uploaded. A sergeant who hadn't been at the scene asked why the stop didn't develop beyond clothing description. The same word kept coming up in those internal conversations. Articulation. What did he have specifically? Because black shirt, black glasses didn't articulate reasonable suspicion by itself in a crowded park, not when half the park could be dressed the same. Not when there was no witness pointing, not when there was no observed weapon, not when the call was vague and the officer didn't confirm details before escalating. Then there was the radio framing. Departments care about officer language on the air because it becomes the first version of the report. If the first version is inflated, everything after it looks like cover. And when a supervisor releases the person at the scene, it tells reviewers the officer's framing didn't match the reality. And then came the one detail that turned this from questionable to liability in the eyes of admin: the hands-on contact allegation. Even if nobody could prove it yet, it forced an inquiry. Because if a citizen says an officer put hands on them without justification, and the rest of the stop doesn't have clean legal footing, investigators don't shrug it off. They pull Bodycam. They pull GPS. They check policies about detentions, searches, and escalation language. They don't do it out of kindness. They do it because lawsuits cost money. By the second week, Edward received what departments often send when they know something's hot: a formal acknowledgement letter. It didn't admit anything. It didn't apologize. It confirmed the complaint was received and under review. At the same time, the online story evolved. People tried to make Edward the hero, but he didn't let that become the focus. He kept redirecting it back to the point. Vague descriptions used as excuses, Idaho demands without clear basis, an escalation when someone refuses. He also made a deliberate choice. He stopped arguing with strangers online. Instead, he met with a civil rights attorney in person, not to talk big, but to make sure every step was done correctly. Preserving video, preserving witness contact, documenting emotional and professional impact, and preparing for the city's predictable responses. And the attorney told him the truth most people don't hear until it's too late. The wind wasn't yelling on the sidewalk. The wind was making the department answer in writing. Because once you force answers in writing, people can't pretend they didn't know what happened. That's when the department made its first real move. Not public, but internal. Officer Tiller was quietly instructed to route stops like that through a supervisor sooner. His proactive contacts were reduced. He wasn't punished on paper yet, just managed, watched, guided. The kind of administrative tightening that looks like nothing until you realize it's the department protecting itself from you. And Edward could tell it was working because the department's tone changed. They stopped leaning so hard on the gun call as a shield and started talking about community concerns, communication, and reviewing procedures. That language meant one thing. They didn't want this turning into a pattern story. But the truth was, it already had. Because Edward didn't just have footage. He had a supervisor on camera ending the stop. And that, more than anything, was the department's problem. Weeks later, the park bench moment didn't live in the park anymore. It lived in files, inboxes, and review folders. Edward didn't treat it like a viral clip. He treated it like evidence. He packaged everything: his full recording, timestamps, the supervisor's arrival, the radio framing, and the exact point where the stop ended because it couldn't legally go anywhere. He added the second angle from the older woman who had been filming quietly. Then he did the part most people skip. He made it formal. A complaint went in with a clean timeline. Records requests followed right behind it, dispatch notes, CAD logs, both officers' Bodycam, and any internal report created off that gun call. And once those requests hit the department, the story stopped being emotional and started being measurable. Because now the city had to answer one question in writing. What was the lawful basis for turning black shirt and black glasses into an ID demand and an escalation threat? Inside the department, the review didn't look like justice. It looked like risk management. Supervisors pulled the footage and compared it to the call details. They listened to the radio traffic, especially how Officer Tiller framed Edward as uncooperative in a weapon investigation. They watched the moment the supervisor arrived and ended it. And the more they watched, the clearer it got. The stop didn't collapse because Edward got lucky. It collapsed because the foundation was thin. That's where the consequences started, quietly. Officer Tiller didn't get a public spectacle. Instead, he got the kind of discipline departments prefer because it leaves less public footprint, increased oversight, corrective counseling, and mandatory training. His discretionary stops got scrutinized. His reports got read harder. And in the months after, his supervisors made sure he wasn't freelancing the same way, especially on calls involving vague descriptions. In other words, he got put on a shorter leash. Then the department did what departments do when a clip exposes a pattern. They issued internal guidance. Officers were reminded that vague clothing descriptions alone didn't equal reasonable suspicion, and that ID just because I said so wasn't a lawful shortcut. Weapon calls required corroboration, something observable, something specific, or a witness who could actually identify the subject. They also pushed a message about language. Escalation talk like, "It'll get worse," created problems because it sounded like punishment for exercising rights, and it played terribly on camera. Even the park patrol routine shifted. People who spent time there noticed it first. Officers started approaching slower, explaining more, keeping more distance. Stops that would have turned into arguments before got redirected into questions that ended quicker, because now everyone knew cameras were part of the environment. As for Edward, he didn't walk away feeling victorious. He walked away feeling clear. He got confirmation that the complaint was processed. He got records back that matched what he already knew. And behind the scenes, the city pushed toward resolution the way cities do when they don't want a courtroom replay of a bad stop. Quiet negotiation, controlled language, and a settlement-style outcome that didn't admit wrongdoing, but still acknowledged cost. So here's the question. If you were sitting there and an officer tried to turn your clothes into a description, would you hand over ID just to make it end? Or would you hold your line and record it? Drop your answer in the comments. Share this with somebody who needs it, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more story times where accountability actually shows up.
You ran that red light. License and registration.
Officer, we're an ALS ambulance on an active trauma response. We cleared the intersection per protocol. Please, this call is time.
I'm not debating. Give me your info.
We are in a rush because someone could die if we're delayed.
Oh, don't interfere with my stop.
Post-industrial.
This was one of those situations that started off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we get into it, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if you pay attention to stories about power, accountability, and moments where the system slips, hit like and subscribe, because this entire story turns on minutes that never came back. This happened in Clearwater, Florida, on Gulf to Bay Boulevard near Belcher Road. Medic 12 sat on the shoulder with its emergency lights still flashing, painting the pavement red and blue. The siren wasn't fully blasting anymore, but it hadn't gone silent either. It let out that muted, restless whine ambulances make when they're supposed to be moving and aren't. Maya Chen was in the driver's seat. She was the lead paramedic on shift, and the one responsible for getting them to the scene. Her hands were steady on the wheel, posture forward, eyes fixed ahead like she was ready to pull out at any second. Andre Ruiz sat in the passenger seat. The dispatch tablet was already open in his lap, the active trauma call glowing on the screen. He also had the printed run sheet in his hand. Timestamp, unit assignment, priority level, everything clearly documented. They weren't heading back to station. They weren't clearing a call. They were supposed to be first on scene. Minutes earlier, dispatch had sent them to a multi-vehicle crash with possible entrapment and 2 critical patients. Fire units were still en route. Medic 12 was the closest advanced life support unit available. That was why they were running lights and sirens. That was why time mattered. They had approached an intersection, slowed, cleared it, and proceeded through a red light exactly as protocol allowed. That was when the cruiser lit up behind them. At first, neither of them believed it. Emergency vehicles don't get stopped in the middle of active trauma responses, not like this. But when the loudspeaker came on ordering the ambulance to pull over, Maya made a split-second decision that would later be questioned from every angle. If she ignored the order, the situation could escalate. If it escalated, they'd lose even more time. So she pulled over. Officer Kyle Mercer stepped out of his patrol car like this was a standard traffic stop. 11 months on the job. Solo patrol. Still close enough to the academy that rules mattered more to him than context. He approached the driver's window already set on enforcement. He focused on the red light and ignored the emergency lights still flashing behind him. He demanded license and registration, as if this were a private vehicle and not a fully marked ambulance on an active call. Andre made sure the tablet stayed visible. He held the run sheet up where it could be seen. Everything needed to verify. The emergency was right there. Mercer barely looked at it. From his posture and pacing, it was clear he'd already decided the stop was about control. He didn't ask dispatch to verify. He didn't call a supervisor. He treated the moment like a challenge to his authority instead of a medical emergency unfolding somewhere else. Maya stayed calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She followed protocol and radioed dispatch, reporting that they were being held on a traffic stop while responding to an active trauma call and requesting police supervision. Dispatch confirmed what was already true. The call was active. Medic 12 was still primary. They began trying to reach police command. But cross-channel communication is slow when seconds matter. While radios crackled and calls stacked up, Mercer ran IDs. Everything came back clean. No flags, no issues, no reason to continue the stop. And yet, he didn't release them. Instead, he started writing a citation. This was the moment where time stopped being theoretical. Every second the pen moved across that paper was another second without advanced care at the crash scene. Andre understood it immediately. He tried to de-escalate, suggesting the officer follow them and handle any issue later. Mercer shut that down and warned him not to interfere. 14 minutes passed before a supervisor finally intervened and ordered the ambulance released. By then, the outcome was already sliding into place. Maya pulled back onto Gulf to Bay hard, lights blazing, sirens screaming again. The crash scene was only 2 minutes away. 2 minutes too late. 2 minutes after being released, Medic 12 hit the crash scene on Gulf to Bay like a sprint that started 14 minutes too late. Fire engines had just arrived. Their lights were already bouncing off twisted metal and scattered glass. The road was a grid of hazards, angled bumpers, steam, debris, and people standing in shock near the shoulder with phones in their hands. Because that's what people do now when something terrible happens in public. Captain Rob Mallory was already in motion, directing his crew towards the worst impact point. He saw the ambulance and his first reaction wasn't relief. It was confusion. Medic 12 was the closest unit. Everybody on that scene knew that. In a response like this, the first ALS rig should have been there early, not arriving behind the first wave of suppression. Mallory met them the second they stepped out. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He demanded to know where they had been. Not because he wanted an argument, because he needed to understand what the scene had already lost. Maya answered in one line, clean and blunt. A traffic stop. That landed wrong at first, the way a sentence sounds when the brain rejects it. Mallory made her repeat it, not because he didn't hear, but because he couldn't accept that it was real. While that exchange happened, Andre was already scanning for patients, doing what experienced medics do when they know the clock has been running without them. He moved fast, but not frantic. Fast enough to be useful, controlled enough to be accurate. There were 2 victims flagged as critical. Lauren Bishop was one of them. Teacher, mom of 2, the kind of name that would later be said carefully on the news. Frank Delgado was the other. Construction supervisor, someone who spent his life on job sites and would be described later as dependable, the guy who always showed up. Firefighters had done what they could with what they had. They had controlled hazards, established scene safety, started basic interventions. But fire crews weren't ALS. They didn't carry the same meds, the same advanced airway capability, the same cardiac tools. They could hold the line. They couldn't replace the ambulance that was supposed to already be there. Mallory's crew had just finished a quick assessment on one of the victims and relayed what they'd seen. There had been faint signs when they arrived. Not a miracle, not a guarantee. Just enough to make the next few minutes matter. And that was the part nobody could undo. Maya and Andre moved in with the efficiency of people who've done this 1,000 times. No drama, no big gestures, just hands and eyes and protocols firing in sequence. They checked for pulse. They checked breathing. They checked responsiveness. They reassessed, because good medics don't accept the first answer when the stakes are this high. Andre found nothing. Maya confirmed it. No pulse, no signs of life. The kind of confirmation that goes quiet in your head even while everything around you stays loud. And in that moment, the traffic stop stopped being an argument about rules. It became an event with a measurable cost. Because there's a difference between being late and being late when someone still had a chance. Maya didn't collapse. Andre didn't curse. They didn't act out. They did what professionals do when the outcome is already sealed. They documented, they communicated, they moved to the next task because a scene like that doesn't pause for grief. But the scene felt it anyway. Mallory looked at the ambulance like it had arrived from another timeline, one where it should have been there earlier and wasn't. His confusion turned into a cold, focused anger, not at the medics, but at the idea that a patrol stop could override a trauma response. That kind of anger doesn't stay on the roadside, it travels. And by the time the scene wrapped and the units cleared, the most important thing about that night wasn't the wreck itself. It was the 14 minutes that vanished on the shoulder of the road, while a citation was written like time was unlimited. The story didn't explode because people were emotional. It exploded because everything was recorded. Back on Gulf to Bay, after the scene cleared and the chaos settled into paperwork, Maya and Andre did what experienced crews always did after something went wrong in a way that wasn't medical. They documented the timeline like it would be read later by people who weren't there, because they knew it would. The run sheet already had the basics: dispatch timestamp, call type, unit assignment. The tablet had the live call history. Their radio traffic was logged. And behind them, Officer Kyle Mercer's body camera had been running for the entire stop. His voice, his posture, his pacing, his choices. This wasn't going to come down to opinion. It was going to come down to minutes and proof. The first thing that made this different was how clean the verification could have been. Andre had put the dispatch screen in the officer's line of sight. He had physically held a printed run sheet, like a receipt for reality. Medic 12 didn't need a debate. They needed one radio call. That call didn't happen. Instead, Mercer turned it into a roadside process. IDs were run, nothing hit. No warrants, no issues. Yet the stop didn't end, because by then it wasn't about confirming an emergency. It was about finishing the ticket. That detail mattered later, because once it was obvious the ambulance was legitimate, every additional second became harder to justify. Dispatch had tried to clean it up from their end. They confirmed emergency status was active. They attempted cross-channel contact with the police department. They escalated the request. But it wasn't a direct line. It never was. It was relays and hold times and someone trying to reach someone else, while the scene on Gulf to Bay kept moving without advanced care. That's how systems fail, without anyone having to raise their voice. Sergeant Dana Holloway got pulled into it the way supervisors always do. Late because the system wasn't designed for speed between agencies, only for documentation after the fact. When she finally reached Mercer, the first thing she needed was the reason, not the general concept, the exact reason. Why an emergency vehicle marked as active trauma response was being held on the shoulder. Mercer's justification was simple. He had seen the ambulance go through a red light and decided traffic enforcement still applied. Holloway's response wasn't philosophical. It was operational. Emergency vehicles had protocol. Verification could be done by radio. If there was an issue, it could be addressed after the call, without freezing a trauma response on the roadside. She ordered him to clear the ambulance. That should have been the end of it. But Mercer didn't pivot fast. That was another point the footage later made painfully clear. There was a stall, a finish-the-process hesitation, the kind of delay that feels small to the person holding the pen and enormous to the people staring at a dispatch clock. When the release finally happened, it didn't look like teamwork. It looked like a lecture attached to paperwork. And that became the second thing that made this blow up: the tone. Because in situations like this, departments can sometimes hide behind the fog of confusion, miscommunication, bad radio, unclear status. But Mercer's body cam didn't show confusion. It showed certainty. It showed an officer treating a trauma response like a teachable moment for compliance. Meanwhile, the fire captain's reaction at the scene got documented too, because fire crews record, by report if not by camera. The absence of ALS on arrival was noted. The presence of faint signs earlier was noted. The timeline became a straight line: stop, delay, arrival, outcome. And once the line was drawn, people started asking the same question in different ways. Because in modern America, you don't just have witnesses, you have footage. And by the time the internal conversations began, this wasn't just an incident anymore, it was a record. Once this hit the outside world, it stopped being an internal matter overnight. The reason was simple. There were too many records telling the same story. Dispatch logs showed Medic 12 was primary on an active trauma call. Radio traffic showed Maya requested a PD supervisor while still on that call. Fire reports showed ALS should have arrived earlier and Mercer's Bodycam captured the rest. An officer treating an emergency ambulance like a routine traffic stop while the clock kept running. By the next morning, reporters weren't chasing rumors. They were chasing a timeline. And the phrase that made people freeze when they heard it, because it sounded too dumb to be real, was the same one Captain Rob Mallory reacted to at the scene. Traffic stop. That phrase spread because it explained the one thing everyone kept asking: why the closest ALS unit arrived late. When the department stepped in front of cameras, they didn't have room to soften it. The chief called it indefensible and confirmed the obvious point. The officer knew it was an ambulance with emergency lights active. That killed the easiest excuse. The idea it was confusion, it wasn't. It was a choice. The union's first response tried to hide behind training language, implying the officer was simply enforcing rules and following procedure. But that line collapsed fast because procedure doesn't look like ignoring a dispatch tablet and a printed run sheet, refusing quick radio verification, and continuing the stop after IDs came back clean. And it definitely doesn't look like delaying release even after a supervisor gets involved. Public pressure forced the messaging to shift from defense to distance. Inside internal affairs, the investigation didn't start with feelings. It started with timestamps. They overlaid dispatch assignment, unit status, radio transmissions, and the exact window of the stop. The number that kept coming back was 14 minutes. Not a momentary check, but long enough to change what late means in trauma care. Maya and Andre's statements were tight and consistent. Active trauma dispatch. Proof presented immediately. Supervisor requested through dispatch. Release delayed anyway. Captain Mallory's documentation focused on the gap. ALS was missing when it mattered, and included the detail that one victim had shown faint signs when fire arrived before advanced care ever touched them. Sergeant Dana Holloway's involvement made the failure even clearer. She instructed Mercer to clear the ambulance and verify by radio, not roadside. That created the core problem Mercer couldn't outrun. The entire stop could have been verified in seconds. One call to dispatch, one quick confirmation. Instead, he ran the stop like a normal enforcement scenario, ran IDs, found nothing, and still chose to write a citation while an active trauma call stayed pending. The case turned on one question that kept getting asked in different rooms by different people. Why didn't he verify by dispatch immediately? Because once that's asked, everything else becomes secondary. You can argue about traffic laws all day, but you can't justify refusing the fastest verification method available when the consequences are measured in survival windows. By the time depositions began, Mercer's explanation narrowed into a weak defense. He believed rules applied equally, and he was enforcing the law. The attorneys didn't fight him on philosophy. They pinned him to operational reality. They forced the comparison between what he could have done, radio verification and release, and what he did do, roadside detention and a ticket. And then they landed the question that ended the debate, whether his principle outweighed medical protocol when lives were on the line. After that, consequences weren't optional. They were unavoidable. Mercer was suspended and fined. The department moved to separate from him, and he resigned before he could be formally terminated because the footage made him radioactive for any agency that might consider hiring him. In law enforcement, that kind of documented, high-profile failure doesn't fade. It follows you. Civil lawsuits followed the same logic as the investigation. Preventable delay, documented deviation from protocol, fatal outcome. The city settled wrongful death claims for a combined amount around $4 million. Not because money fixes anything, but because the city couldn't argue the timeline away. And the last consequence was the one departments only make when they know the public saw the truth. Policy change. Clearwater updated procedures so that if an officer ever stops an emergency vehicle, the officer must contact dispatch immediately and must have supervisor authorization to continue holding that vehicle. In other words, no more roadside ego games with a trauma call on the clock. That's the part people don't like admitting. This didn't require a new invention or special training. It required one basic step that was available the entire time. Verify fast, then clear the ambulance. In the end, Mercer couldn't hide behind rules or rules. The footage and timestamps showed the ambulance could have been verified in seconds, but he chose to hold them anyway, and kept holding them even after a supervisor told him to clear it. He was suspended, fined, and resigned, and that kind of documented failure made him effectively unhireable in law enforcement. The city settled the wrongful death cases for about $4 million, and Clearwater updated policy so any officer stopping an emergency vehicle must verify with dispatch immediately and need supervisor authorization to keep that vehicle stopped. Now tell me, was that justice or paperwork pretending to be accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and like and subscribe for more stories where the truth gets recorded and consequences actually follow.
Sir, you need to talk to me. Hand me your ID, now.
What's this about?
You're not detained, but you're not walking off. Show your ID.
If I'm not detained, the ID demand isn't a command. So which is it?
That folder, HIPAA violation. That's a felony.
This folder isn't a random patient's file. It's mine. And I'm internal
Turn
affairs.
that camera off.
This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. What city or state? And if you like stories where power gets checked by facts, cameras, and calm boundaries, hit like and subscribe. Now back to it. Detective John Hale didn't look like he was there to cause trouble. He looked like a man trying to finish something and leave. Hands visible, shoulders steady, one palm resting on the folder like it was an anchor. Officer Miller acted like he'd been invited to take over the room. His voice carried on purpose. He told John he needed to talk for a second, loud enough that people waiting for blood work and discharge papers turned their heads. Behind the counter, Evan Ross, the receptionist, went pale in real time. He'd called for help, but he hadn't expected the temperature to jump this fast. John stayed calm. He asked what this was about. Officer Miller said Evan had reported John for harassing patients and trying to take a file without authorization. He stepped closer as he said it, closing distance, not to hear better, but to control the space. John didn't flinch. He pushed back on the accusation without raising his voice. He asked whose file Officer Miller thought it was. That should have slowed everything down. It didn't. Officer Miller demanded identification and labeled it a felony like the word itself did the work. His hand drifted toward his belt, not drawing anything, just making sure the lobby remembered he had the uniform and the tools. John responded with one clean question. Was he being detained? Officer Miller hesitated and tried to live in the middle. He said John wasn't being detained, but John cut him off. Still even, if he wasn't being detained, then the ID demand wasn't a command. So which was it? That's when the room sharpened. Not louder, just more aware. Because everyone had seen this before, "You're free to go," said with the body language of "try it." Officer Miller ignored the detention question and went back to the folder. He said John had taken a patient file without authorization. John tapped the folder lightly and corrected the premise. He said he wasn't taking a patient's file. He said he was handling official business. Officer Miller repeated official business with a tone that turned it into a joke. Then he said the quiet part out loud. John didn't look official. That line landed harder than the officer realized. It wasn't about policy. It was about perception. Evan Ross tried to intervene, clearly panicking now. He explained he only called because John had been asking questions and people got uncomfortable. And there it was. Not a crime. Not a clear threat. Discomfort. John didn't attack Evan. He named the problem. This was being built on vibes. Someone didn't like his tone at the counter, and suddenly the word harassment was being thrown around like it was a fact. Officer Miller didn't like hearing it framed that way. He told John not to get cute, and his eyes flicked to John's phone. John had been recording, not theatrically, not shoved in anyone's face, just held steady, angled down, capturing the interaction in a public lobby already covered by security cameras. Officer Miller pressured him about recording like the phone was the real offense. He ordered John to put it down. John refused, calmly, firmly. He framed it as documentation of a public interaction. Then he tightened the boundary again. If Officer Miller believed there was a crime, he needed to articulate it. If he was detaining John, he needed to say it. Otherwise, he needed to step back. That's when Officer Miller reached for a scary word he thought would force compliance. He pointed at the folder and declared it a HIPAA violation. John corrected the pronunciation without being dramatic. Then he pointed out the obvious. Officer Miller didn't even know what was in the folder. Officer Miller insisted he knew enough. In his mind, the mere act of holding the folder made it illegal. He kept repeating felony like it was a warning siren. This was the chess game right here. Officer Miller leaning on volume and vague legal threats. John refusing to give him anything he didn't have the authority to take. A charge nurse, Lila Nguyen, passed through the edge of the scene, slowed for half a second, and took in the details the way medical staff learn to. The tone, the distance, the phone recording, the fact that John's posture didn't match the story being told about him. John asked again, without spiraling into a lecture, whether this was detention or a voluntary conversation. Officer Miller still wouldn't answer cleanly. He kept pressing. He kept crowding. He kept treating Evan's discomfort like probable cause. And Evan Ross stood there watching his own decision turn into something bigger, realizing too late he hadn't reported a crime. He'd reported a feeling. John took a breath like he'd reached the end of patience, not anger. Something colder. Like someone who'd already decided how much time he was willing to waste. He told Officer Miller carefully that the best thing he could do right now was walk away. Officer Miller scoffed and pushed back, like he needed to win in front of the room. John paused. For the first time, the lobby saw something under the calm. Something heavy, like John was carrying a bigger situation than this argument. Then John moved his hand toward the hem of his shirt. Not fast, not aggressive. Just enough movement to trigger the part of Officer Miller's brain trained to react to hands near clothing. Officer Miller's stance shifted immediately. His voice dropped without him meaning to. In the lobby, patient's family staff went quiet in that specific way public spaces did when they sensed an incident crossing from uncomfortable into dangerous. John lifted the edge of his shirt slightly. What he showed wasn't a weapon. It was an injury, bandaging and bruising near his side, fresh enough that it didn't look like an old story. Officer Miller stared at it, visibly recalculating. Evan Ross looked like someone realizing he'd called the police on the wrong person at the worst possible moment. Because whatever happened to John Hale, it didn't match harassing patients. It matched a different kind of work entirely. The moment Detective John Hale showed the bandage at his side, the confrontation stopped being a front desk complaint and started feeling like something the lobby wasn't supposed to be part of. Officer Grant Miller's posture changed first. The volume dropped. The confidence shifted into calculation, like he'd realized he might have walked into the wrong kind of situation. Hale didn't try to win the room. He didn't dramatize it. He simply stated that he'd been shot a few nights earlier during undercover work. No details, no war story. Just a fact that didn't match the story Evan Ross had called in. Miller's eyes went back to the folder, still trying to anchor the situation to something simple. Rules, paperwork, privacy. He kept circling the same accusation. Unauthorized file, hospital policy, serious charges. Hale corrected the assumption without raising his voice. He made it clear the folder wasn't a random patient's information. It was his. That single detail hit the lobby like a hard reset. Evan Ross looked like he understood in real time that he hadn't reported a crime. He'd escalated discomfort into a police intervention, and now it was attached to the wrong person. Hale then revealed the bigger issue in plain terms. He worked internal affairs, and he was there because there were signs someone inside the hospital was leaking sensitive law enforcement information. Not gossip, not paranoia. A real concern that had already caused damage. And suddenly, everything Officer Miller had been doing, demanding ID loudly, threatening charges, arguing in public, trying to control recording, looked worse. Not just rude, risky. Because if Hale was telling the truth, then the danger in that building wasn't a man with a folder. It was someone who benefited from attention being pointed in the wrong direction. Hale kept his phone recording, steady and quiet. He didn't wave it around. He didn't threaten to post anything. He just let the documentation exist, the way someone did when they knew how quickly people rewrote the story later. Miller asked how he was supposed to confirm any of this. Hale gave him a controlled answer. Confirmation could happen through proper channels, but not out loud in the middle of a hospital lobby, not in front of patients and staff, and not in a way that alerted whoever might be listening. That was when Miller finally stepped out of the command voice and into something closer to professionalism. He backed off. He acknowledged he didn't have the full picture. He apologized, not as a performance, but as a correction. Evan Ross tried to speak, but he was visibly shaken. He kept glancing between the uniform and the man he'd labeled suspicious, like he couldn't figure out how the situation had flipped so completely. A nurse drifting near the edge of the scene noticed the shift, too. The staff didn't need the full story to sense it. This wasn't a routine complaint anymore. This was law enforcement business that didn't belong in public conversation. Hale didn't punish the receptionist with words. He didn't comfort him either. He stayed on task. He returned to the counter and pushed the process forward, like this interruption was just another obstacle he'd anticipated. Miller, now aware of the cameras and the phone and the crowd, repositioned himself. He stopped hovering over Hale and started acting like a barrier against further chaos, keeping the space calm, lowering the temperature, making it easier for Hale to finish without more noise. The lobby's attention slowly scattered again, but the tension didn't disappear. It just moved under the surface. Because Hale hadn't come there to argue with a patrol officer. He'd come there to see who inside that building reacted the wrong way when he asked for his own file. And now, thanks to the disruption, whoever was leaking information, if Hale was right, had been given a warning that something was happening. Hale kept his focus on procedure, timing, and control. He didn't rush. He didn't get sloppy. He just kept moving. Because the real test wasn't whether he could win a lobby argument. It was whether the hospital would make a mistake. After Officer Grant Miller backed off, the lobby slowly went back to normal. People looked away and returned to their phones. The receptionist, Evan Ross, kept working, but he looked tense. Detective John Hale stayed calm and stayed on the task. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to see how the hospital handled a records request under pressure. He kept his phone recording quietly. He didn't announce it. He didn't point it at anyone's face. He just kept a clean timeline. Hale continued the request using the normal process. He filled out what they required. He followed the steps. He didn't ask for special treatment. That mattered because he wanted the hospital's response to be defensible and trackable. Evan Ross said he needed to involve a supervisor. He framed it as policy. Hale didn't fight that. A supervisor meant more names involved, more cameras, more system log entries. A supervisor came out and spoke in a calm, professional way. Hale kept his explanation general. He said he was requesting his own record and needed the standard process completed. He did not explain why he wanted it. He did not mention internal affairs again. He did not give extra details. Hale watched how staff responded to a simple request. Some staff acted normal and moved on. Others lingered near the records area longer than they needed to. One staff member stopped nearby without an obvious reason. Another walked past twice. None of that proved anything by itself, but Hale noted the timing. Evan Ross checked his phone under the counter. It was quick. Hale didn't accuse him of anything. People text at work. But the timing stood out because it happened right after a police officer had confronted Hale in the lobby. The supervisor returned to the computer and said they needed a moment to confirm something in the system. Again, that could be routine. Hale stayed quiet and let them work, but he watched for unnecessary delays. Then a call came into the front desk. Evan answered. His face changed. He glanced at Hale, then at the supervisor, then away. The call ended quickly. Hale didn't ask who it was. He didn't demand to see the phone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said he needed the process completed without further delays. That statement did two things. It kept the interaction calm in public. It created a clear point on the recording where Hale requested the standard process to continue. The supervisor pushed the request forward. A few minutes later, Hale received what he came for through the official process. Hale checked the paperwork for names and timestamps. His phone recording captured the handoff. Officer Miller stayed back and didn't interfere again. He looked uncomfortable, but he kept the area quiet, which helped. Hale left without rushing. Outside the lobby, he focused on what mattered. The staff reactions, the phone activity he saw, the unexpected call, and the exact times. Those details were what internal affairs could compare to access logs and camera footage later. Once the hospital access logs came back, John Hale's case stopped being about a heated lobby interaction and became what it should have been from the start, a traceable sequence of actions tied to specific accounts, terminals, and times. The hospital system showed the normal steps for a standard record request. It also showed one action that didn't fit. During the same window when the front desk had taken an unexpected call and the receptionist's demeanor shifted, a user account opened sections of Hale's chart that weren't necessary to process a routine release. It wasn't a harmless click. It was a deeper look than procedure required. Internal affairs didn't jump to conclusions. They did what they always did. They compared it against patterns. They pulled the last few weeks of access history, tied to the same workstation and the same user credentials, then compared those timestamps to other incidents where undercover details had surfaced too early. They looked for the simplest explanation first: training issue, curiosity, or sloppy procedure. But the timing wasn't random. It clustered around moments when police-related patients came through the hospital, and it clustered around moments when staff had no legitimate reason to dig deeper. They interviewed the staff member tied to the access. The employee tried to explain it as routine verification. They said they were following policy, that the system sometimes required extra steps, that they were just making sure the release was correct. IA didn't argue. They took the statement, thanked them, and moved on. Then they pulled the hospital's written policy and matched it line by line against what the employee claimed. The routine verification explanation didn't match what the policy required. The policy didn't require opening those sections. The policy didn't require that level of access. IA now had a gap between the story and the system. At that point, the hospital's compliance department got involved. They had their own reasons to treat this seriously. A staff member accessing records without a proper purpose wasn't just a rumor problem. It was a regulatory problem. It exposed the hospital to real liability. Internal Affairs made it clear that they weren't there to punish normal staff who were caught in the middle of a tense day. They were there to identify whether sensitive law enforcement information was being exposed. They requested the front desk phone logs for the exact time window when the call came in and changed how the receptionist behaved. The hospital provided the incoming number information for the desk line. The incoming call didn't come from a patient family member or another department. It came from an outside number that didn't belong in the hospital workflow. IA then did the next step the proper way. They obtained legal authority to connect the dots outside the hospital. They didn't seize phones without cause. They didn't do hallway interrogations. They used the process that held up in court. When the phone number was run through the right channels, it linked to a person already flagged in a separate gang intelligence file. Not the top of a crew, but someone known for coordinating information and passing messages. Someone who benefited from advance notice when law enforcement activity was near. That's when the hospital leak stopped being a theory. Internal Affairs went back to the staff member tied to the unusual access and brought them in again, this time with a clearer timeline. They didn't threaten, they didn't raise their voices, they presented the verified facts, the exact access timestamps, the exact sections opened, the exact call time to the front desk, and the exact time the staff member's account took the unusual action. The staff member denied intent again, but the denial got thinner. They claimed they never contacted anyone. They claimed they didn't message anyone. They claimed they didn't even know why a gang-related number would be calling the desk line. IA didn't debate it. They followed the trail. They pulled additional camera footage. Not just the lobby-wide view, but angles that showed the desk area, hand movements, and whether a personal phone was in use. It wasn't perfect, but it showed enough to contradict the clean version of events. It showed a quick look down and a brief thumb movement consistent with a message being typed. At the same time, Iowa checked whether the hospital system flagged break glass access. Many systems logged when staff opened protected records without standard need. The hospital system showed those protected accesses were happening more than once, and not only for Hale. That created the next step, a controlled test. Internal Affairs coordinated with the hospital and set a monitored scenario that looked routine on the surface. It didn't involve fake emergencies or complicated setups. It involved a record that would only be accessed by someone who was looking for it, not processing it. They monitored which accounts touched it, which screens were opened, and whether any outside call or message followed. The same account touched it. The same pattern followed. And within minutes, a phone number linked to the same gang contact received a message from a device connected to the employee's personal line. That was enough. At that stage, the case moved out of internal review and into criminal exposure. Internal Affairs brought the district attorney's office into the loop and presented the evidence package. Hospital access logs, policy comparisons, camera footage, phone records obtained through proper process, and the controlled test results. The DA's office didn't need a dramatic confession. They needed a story supported by records. Now, the original reason John Hale had come to the hospital clicked into place. He wasn't there because he wanted special treatment. He was there because he needed to see who would react the wrong way when his name entered the system. The lobby confrontation had been an interference, but it hadn't stopped the trap from working. It just made the time window more obvious. As the hospital leak case progressed, Iowa also looped back to the undercover operation that got Hale shot. They reviewed how his identity had been exposed and whether the hospital leak had contributed directly. They didn't claim what they couldn't prove, but they showed that sensitive information had been moving from the medical side to street contacts, and that movement created a serious risk to any officer whose name appeared in those records. The gang contact tied to the phone number was arrested as well. Charges depended on what the DA could prove: conspiracy, obstruction, and any related offenses tied to violence or intimidation. IA didn't promise the maximum penalty in public. They focused on securing convictions that would stick. Officer Grant Miller's part of the story didn't disappear either. His department reviewed his conduct in the lobby based on dispatch audio, camera footage, and Hale's phone recording. The review wasn't about embarrassing him. It was about whether he had used legal language accurately and whether he had escalated based on assumptions. The conclusion was straightforward. He had treated a voluntary encounter like it wasn't voluntary, threatened felony consequences without confirming key facts, and tried to stop recording without proper cause. He wasn't charged with a crime, but he didn't walk away untouched. He received formal counseling and corrective training. His supervisor documented the incident and required him to complete training on detentions versus consensual contact, public recording rights, and how to handle medical privacy claims without inventing criminal authority. The department also updated its guidance for responding to hospital calls, so officers didn't keep using HIPAA like a threat when what they really meant was, the hospital has a policy. Miller also personally apologized to Hale again later, away from the lobby. Not because an apology fixed everything, but because it mattered to acknowledge what he had done. He had put pressure on the wrong person and helped create a public disturbance in a sensitive environment. Hale didn't accept or reject it dramatically. He treated it like a professional correction and moved forward. For Hale, the outcome wasn't satisfying in the way viral clips make things look satisfying. He still had a healing wound. He still had a case that involved real risk. But he got something that mattered more than a moment of dominance. The leak path was identified, documented, and shut down through a process that could hold up. There were ripple effects beyond the arrests and terminations. The hospital changed how it trained front desk staff and supervisors. Calling police became a last resort tied to specific behaviors, not discomfort. Staff were coached to distinguish between someone being firm and someone being threatening. They added better escalation options that didn't involve handing the situation to a uniform who might escalate it further. The records department tightened permissions, expanded audit alerts, and made it harder for any single staff member to explore chart sections without a documented need. On the law enforcement side, the department's training emphasized something basic but often ignored. Authority didn't replace accuracy. Officers were reminded that if they couldn't articulate a legal basis, they couldn't force compliance by volume. They were also reminded that hospitals were public-facing spaces full of vulnerable people, and unnecessary escalation there did more harm than good. The last piece of the story was quieter. A few weeks later, Hale returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment like any other patient. This time, there was no scene, no shouting, no crowd watching. Just a man walking through a lobby that had learned the hard way what happens when assumptions get treated like facts. And if you think about it, that was the real lesson. The most dangerous situations weren't always the ones that looked dangerous at first. Sometimes the danger started with someone saying they just wanted to be safe, then using that feeling to justify control over someone they didn't understand. That's how bias becomes policy. That's how policy becomes pressure. And that pressure in the wrong moment can ruin lives and compromise real investigations. So here's the question for you. If you were standing in that lobby and you saw an officer demanding ID without a clear detention, and you saw a calm person recording and holding boundaries, what would you have assumed was happening? Would you have trusted the uniform automatically? Or would you have waited for facts? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever seen rules used as a weapon against someone who didn't fit the image people expected, share your experience too. And make sure you subscribe for more story times where calm, documentation, and accountability are what finally win.